Many people, including myself, think of the mid-1960s as the pinnacle of American automobiles. And that's because there's really this great confluence of factors that comes together during this period of time. First of all, the engines and transmissions are smooth, reliable, powerful, just great in almost every respect. This is before the emission standards came into play in the late 60s, early 1970s that significantly reduced horsepower and, let's say, made cars harder to service and also endowed them with, let's say, less favorable drivability characteristics. It's also the time period where you start to get really modern conveniences in a lot of cars. Air conditioning had been around for a while. Actually, Packard had introduced that originally. But now it was becoming increasingly popular on cars. You could get power windows with greater frequency. And the chassis components were becoming increasingly modern, particularly the brake systems, as disc brakes were introduced as optional equipment on many cars. And in a few years, they would become standard. But by this point, even if a car was equipped with drum brakes, they were pretty good drum brakes. The cars could stop really just fine. And the steering, the power steering that was employed during this time frame, while it certainly doesn't have much road feel compared to today's power steering, is very pleasant to drive and accurate. So a lot of those things by the mid-1960s had evolved quite significantly. The other thing that evolved by the mid-1960s was really customers' tastes and their perceptions of automobiles and really what they wanted out of a car. Remember, in the late 1950s, the U.S. went through a recession, and as a consequence, many of the automakers were introducing cars at the lower end of the spectrum. The Valiant is an example, not the Plymouth Valiant. The Valiant was just one from the Chrysler stable. Of course, Chevrolet had the Corvair. Studebaker had the Lark. People always don't like it when I don't mention the Studebaker Lark. That thing was a non-factor by this point in time. But in any case, I will mention it for the Studebaker lovers out there. And I love Studebakers too, particularly the 53 Studebaker. I digress. Let's continue. The Corvair came out in 1960. In 1961, you have the senior compacts from General Motors that were introduced, the Pontiac Tempest, the Olds F-85, the Buick Special. Of course, you have the Ford Falcon being introduced as well. So that was really the emphasis in the early 1960s, probably as a result of the recession and also, frankly, the success of the VW Beetle by that point. But by the mid-1960s, customer tastes were really starting to change. Remember, the economy was picking up steam. The mid-1960s were really a halcyon era in terms of the American economy. And that period from the early to late 60s was a period of economic expansion. And what typically happens during periods of economic expansion in the vehicle market? People buy bigger cars and more expensive cars. And as a result, the automakers started rethinking what even lower-end cars should be. For a long time, Plymouth and Ford and Chevrolet were defined as the low-priced three, the Detroit low-priced three. They forgot about AMC, but oh well. And in any case, the low price three, the purpose of buying one of those cars was really that you got a lower end car with great value. They did have, of course, sporty models like the Plymouth Fury or the Impala SS and upper end trims where you could get more expensive cars in the low price three. But they really never pushed up into the mid-luxury space from a pricing perspective. And the interiors, while nice, were not something that you could kind of close your eyes in. And if you took the badges off, you would ever think that you were in an Oldsmobile or a Buick or a Mercury or something like that. You still knew that you were in a low-price car. Well, that all changed for 1965, when Ford introduced the LTD as its range-topping automobile, and it was a trim package on the Galaxies. The Galaxy had been introduced in 1959 as the range-topping Ford. But by 1965, Ford program planners thought that there was even more daylight between a high-end Ford and, let's say, a Mercury or a Lincoln, and that there was a market for people who were familiar with the Ford brand but wanted to pay a little bit more and get a more luxurious interior. And so the LTD was launched in 1965, and it was really, as I said, a Galaxy with a trim package, and the trim package was meant to dress up the interior. And as we'll talk about in a moment, the 1965 LTD had an interior that you never saw in a car from Ford before, including these beautifully done door panels, rich seating, and even little lights in the doors. That was something that was only found on upper-end cars. Well, the LTD proved so successful that partway through the 1965 model year, Chevrolet introduced the Caprice, and it was only available on the four-door vehicles for 1965. And the Caprice was effectively an Impala with better interior trim. And so Chevrolet threw this package together midway through the 1965 model year in order to combat what I said, the LTD. Now, the Caprice was also quite successful. And for 1966, that was the first year that the Caprice was really a dedicated model. And in fact, it got its own roofline on the coupes, separate and distinct from the fastback roofline on the Impala. The Impala had that fastback that you can see in this picture. The Caprice had a more formal roofline with a vertical style C-pillar, kind of in keeping with that Cadillac-y luxury styling cue, where Cadillacs had that very formal C-pillar that harkened all the way back to the coach building days, where passengers wanted some privacy when they were sitting in the back of their car. Now, while 1966 was the first model year of the Caprice, first full model year of the Caprice, 65 was the first model year, but it was introduced partway through 1965. 1966 would also be the first model year where Plymouth would introduce a variant to compete with the LTD, and that was the VIP. Yes, the Plymouth VIP. No, that is not an oxymoron, or perhaps it is, but Plymouth didn't want you to think that. Because you are a VIP driving around in your Plymouth VIP. You can't afford a Dodge. You can't afford a Chrysler. You can't afford an Imperial, but you can get the Plymouth. And so the Plymouth VIP was also a reaction to that Ford LTD. And it was effectively a Fury with a better interior inside. And a great interior it was. So in this particular video, what we're going to talk about is the styling and who really did it best between the Chevrolet, the Ford, and the Plymouth. And which one would you have bought if you were a buyer during this time frame? So let's get started and talk about the Chevrolet. So as we transition to the Caprice, we're going to talk quite a bit about the coupe, because the coupe itself was new, as I mentioned, for 1966. You could get a four-door Caprice in hardtop form for 1965. You could still get the four-door for 1966. But now you got, in addition, the coupe with this formal style C-pillar roofline. And one thing to note is that up front, there's a lot of new sheet metal here. It doesn't necessarily look it, but obviously the grille, the headlamp treatment, the front area is totally different from the 1965 version. And the fenders are also different and have a feature line that's kind of hard to see in this photo. I'll pick another one to show it, but there is a crease line that runs kind of parallel with the outer edge of the fender, just below it, kind of halfway down it, the fender, you'll see that crease. And that's something that is unique to the 1966 model year cars. Now up front, you have kind of a major-minor theme going on with the grille, the major theme being these very thin rectilinear lines that run cross-car, and you can see behind them there is a vertical feature and texture to the grille as well, but it plays on a secondary level versus the primary read, which is that horizontal nature of the grille. And that, coupled with this kind of high aspect ratio, the large width versus relatively small height to the grille, makes the car have this wide appearance up front. And that was something the designers were trying to do kind of across the board on most cars during this era. Longer, lower, wider was the designer's mantra during the mid-1960s and into the 1970s. You also have the bumper seamlessly integrated into the grille, and you're starting to see this split bumper grille theme come to life on the Chevrolet. That would be enhanced as you would go through the early 1970s. I think the 1972 Caprice perhaps had that split bumper grille executed most predominantly. And interesting bumper guards up front which flank the license plate frame. Now, if you look down the body side of the car, you'll notice that at the door it really has constant section. And by that I mean if you slice the car in half and you looked at the door skin, you'd see that it's basically the same all the way throughout the door, and it continues on forward. But then after the door, you have this huge bulge that kind of comes out around the rear quarter glass opening and continues rearward to form the top of the quarter panel. And that was designed to really give the owner or a buyer the visual cue that they had a little bit of Corvette in their Caprice or Impala. Of course, the Stingray Corvette had those 4 fender bulges on the car. Here you just got 2, one on either side in the rear. The fronts didn't have that, but it was a styling cue from the sporty Corvette, and I think it worked well on the Caprice. Now, one of the reasons that I picked this photo is because I wanted to show the body side of the Caprice in the light and the overall clean reflections. You don't have a lot of distortion in the reflections here, particularly as you look at the reflections going from the midsection of the car downward. And that's really because this car doesn't have a clean, kind of crisp rocker brake. It's got a very subtle brake and a crease at the lower portion of the car where it tucks into the rocker panel. In fact, that crease is so subtle it barely even reads in this particular photo. But you don't have a lot of tuck-in beneath that. It's relatively straight. And you could compare that as an example versus a 1966 Oldsmobile that has a harder edge and significantly more tuck-in. So the Chevrolet designers were trying to keep that continuous reflection and also give this car a little bit of heft in the side view so that you didn't read that crease as distinctively and that you saw the car as more substantial, because that crease would serve to break up the lighting and create a shadow. And then as a consequence, that shadow would make your eye feel like the car had visually gotten lower or just had less dimension when viewing it from the side. So that's not what the Chevrolet designers wanted. They wanted you to read this as one continuous form. Here's a better picture to see that, and you can now see in that photo that very faint feature line at the rocker area where the body starts to tuck in, but it's kind of beautifully executed such that it's not distorting the reflections. It's so faint that it's there, but it doesn't distort what the reflections are or the highlights. Notice the highlights on this car in this lighting aren't changing all that much south of that crease where the body starts tucking in. Now, as I said, the consequence of that is this car appears to have visual height. And if you look at the door looks pretty massive. So the car has some interesting proportions. The roof to the door, it doesn't look like there's as much glass area. It looks a little bit squat in this position, in part because the door just visually looks so large owing to the fact that there's not that much tuck-in at the rocker. We'll see some different philosophies on other cars of the era. I would say the LTD and the VIP really don't have that rocker tuck-in either. So the low-priced cars were, I guess, trying to look more substantial, perhaps. And I think, they look good overall. Now, while that was a black car, we're going to take a look at a white car because it's a little bit easier to see the highlights and lowlights on a car like this. You can really see that crease that I was mentioning that parallels the fender line. That's kind of halfway down the fender and how it runs all the way to the rear, kind of forming the top edge of the tail lamps. The bulge that I was mentioning before, that crease is starting to come alive on this white car. So you're also starting to notice how these different features kind of show themselves differently depending on the color of the car. If it's light, if it's dark, if it's a metallic paint. The white cars really help you see when a car is throwing a shadow on itself. You can also see the shadow of the cars throwing with that bulge that starts right under the rear quarter glass. I noticed that you have a low light there on the underside of that bulge. By the way, this car also has very faint wheel lips. They're not all that pronounced, and that's something that other divisions from General Motors would certainly execute differently. I would say the 1966 Oldsmobile Tornado with its very pronounced wheel flares would be the antithesis of this. You also see the W front end, very typical for this time frame. The kind of out, in, out, in, out, if you were to stare at the front end from a bird's eye view. Very thin A-pillars, of course, the vent windows, the formal style C-pillar that is, it's formal, but it's actually, the formality is accentuated by the cut line for the rear quarter glass, which is almost perfectly vertical. The sail panel actually has a little bit of rake to it, but that rear quarter glass cut makes it look visually a bit more vertical than it is. So designers are kind of half in, half out, I think, on wanting to do the vertical style sail panel. But, you know, it did differentiate the Caprice from the Impala fastback roofline. I will just point out that for this car, by and large, the highlights are pretty uniform and have very subtle transitions. There's not a lot of sharp breaks or coves. There, of course, is that bulge around at the rear quarter panel that does create different highlights and lowlights. But overall, aside from that, pretty smooth and continuous transitions of highlights. When we look at the Ford, we're going to see something completely different in the Plymouth as well. And out back, we also have some interesting features of the Caprice. Notice the backlight is relatively small and kind of pinched in. It's a really formal style backlight, similar again to luxury cars of the era, as opposed to this vast expanse of glass that you would get with the fastback design. Now out rear, you do have the horizontal 3 tail lamp theme that was started with the 1958 Impala. A 3-piece bumper, got to help the insurance folks. It's not a single-piece bumper. It's actually 3 pieces. You can see the cut lines there. And just very gentle surfaces, by and large, aside from the tops of the quarter panels that form this sharp crease. And you can see how that's breaking up the highlights. The deck lid, given the light source here, is very illuminated. The body side is not, and it breaks right at that crease. But the deck lid is flat. You have the horizontally themed taillights. You have a very clean horizontal bumper. You have relatively minimal height of the deck lid too. So again, accentuating the width of this car. And I think a handsome look to the rear, although I have to say I like the 1965 variants better from the Chevrolet stable, but 66 was still a good year. And as we mentioned, the Caprice was introduced because the LTD interior was so nice. Chevrolet had to compete. And if you take a look here at the 1966 Caprice interior, it's hard to really say that you're looking at a Chevrolet interior. It looks rich and finely detailed, lots of bright work. It is fake wood grain, but still looks very convincing. Lots of pleating on the seats and door panels to make them look rich. Even the hardware just looks like it belongs in a more expensive vehicle. Today, this would all be plastic and kind of bleh, but this just looks like a more expensive car than what it really is. And Chevrolet designers did a fantastic job. The only thing that kind of signifies that it's a little cheap is that this model does not, I believe, have air conditioning, and it has the Bowden cable activated HVAC. There's no vacuum servos here to change the airflow out of different doors. You have to operate that all yourself with those 3 levers. But really, aside from that, it's pretty fantastic. And here's one more interior. Notice the steering wheel in this case is the telescoping steering wheel where you turn that ring counterclockwise to have the wheel telescope in and out. Just a fantastic design, tons of pleating on the seats, rich interior, especially in this price class. And now let's transition to the 1965 LTD. Now, a very different styling philosophy on the LTD, but some similar elements as the Caprice. First of all, this was the stacked headlamp era for Ford, and stacked headlamps were becoming pretty popular across many different makes by this point. Pontiac would be predominant among them, Cadillac as well, and we're going to see the 66 Plymouth VIP was also another stacked headlamp car. But a number of differences in terms of the styling between this Ford and the Chevy. First of all, take a look at that flat belt line and the that flat, I would say, kind of surface transition, the radius that starts just behind the headlamps and then continues all the way back on the car. It's generally flat, and you can almost imagine how this car was sculpted in clay. The designers kind of put a big mass of clay around the vehicle, and then they drag the template across that whole section from the front all the way back, even past the door. And then they probably came back and scalloped out that little area underneath the crease, that lower crease that sits just above the 390 badge on this car, aft of the wheel, and probably then did also the wheel lips and the other little lines and features. But very constant section to this car. If you were to kind of slice it in half and do that partway down the hood, partway down the car, like at the door midsection, and then also halfway down the quarter panel, the cross-section and what it looked like would really not change much. Of course, the Chevrolet had that big bulge, remember, on the rear quarter panel. The door had pretty constant section, but it did change from the fender to the door to the quarter. Here it's pretty much the same all the way. And that's kind of emblematic of Ford styling. The only changes would really be, as I mentioned, that lower feature line and how that transitions as you go back on the car. Now you also notice everything here is a bit more stiff, a bit more upright, a bit tighter than the Caprice, and you can even see that from this photo with the highlights. Notice the hood is illuminated quite well, but the radius is relatively sharp as the surface transitions from horizontal to vertical as it kind of rolls over the side. And notice that the passenger side of the car is not really lit at all as a consequence. C-pillar has some rake to it, but overall I would say this car is a bit upright and stiff. I don't know if I care for that scalloped out section in the lower part of the car. You also see a very fine crease that really initiates that section in front of the wheel. It kind of starts up by the headlamp bucket, goes down, and then it goes rearward, and it's interrupted by the wheel arch. I picked this photo of a four-door LTD to show a little bit of what I was mentioning with respect to the rear view as well as the highlights. And notice, like I said, it's just more crisp, has crisper edges in general than the Chevrolet, particularly that quarter. Notice how crisp the edge is as the quarter transitions from the horizontal to the vertical. Interestingly, the C-pillar is pretty rounded and not as crisp, so a bit of a different philosophy there. And then you can really see that line that continues or starts up at the front of the car, the lower line, and then dives downward, kind of gets interrupted by the rear wheel, and then continues out back to form the bumper. You can really tell how this car was sculpted. Like that quarter was sculpted probably all as one template, like kind of drag section. Then the designer went back and scalloped out that lower section. You don't see that with the GMs. It just appears more organic. And that was just how Ford styling was during this era. It's kind of more mechanical, more architectural, more upright and stiff. So I think that, it's not a bad looking car, but it's not quite as good looking as I would say the Chevrolet was. Although you do get the ventilation louvers aft of the backlight. So this car really did have good ventilation, especially with the vent windows. You could crack one of those and really get the airflow flowing through the cabin. And as we transition to the interior, we saw what made the LTD so special to begin with, and really what set Chevrolet and Plymouth back on their heels when it was introduced. This rich, detailed cabin, again, fake wood grain, but convincing in how it looks. Deep pleating on the seats with really interesting fabrics as well. Take a look at the door panel and the cross-hatched pattern, the X pattern that adorns it. Something similar would later adorn the 1969 Mark III. And you have the lights, as I mentioned before, in the bottom of the door, something that you didn't really see in this price class until the LTD introduced it. So in general, this was a handsome place or a handsome interior and a good place to be. And very simple dash in terms of the theme, but something that's elegant and formal and simple all at the same time. And you can see why buyers really enjoy their LTD and cruising in them, because they were such comfortable and rich-looking places to be. And now we transition to the Plymouth VIP. As I previously mentioned, the VIP was new for the 1966 model year. It had just a brief run. It would continue on through 1969, and that was pretty much it. And the VIP, one could say, is a very important Plymouth. But I actually like the styling of the VIP a bit better than the LTD, even though both have some similar elements, like the stacked headlamps up front, obviously that negative rake kind of front end where the Top headlamp is jutting forward, giving you a little bit of that sense of motion. That's complemented by the Brightwork trim on this car that really goes down the entire body side and outlines the upper portion of what I'll call a frame. Two very distinctive feature lines that run almost the length of the entire car. It's hard to see in this picture, but I wanted to show the front end first. I'll go to another one to talk a little bit more about the side view. But as I said, you have the stacked headlamp up front. You have this interesting grille that's kind of divided, but not. The rectilinear theme continues all throughout the grille. It is true wall-to-wall, continuing on underneath the headlamps, continuing through the center portion, again, helping accentuate the width of the car. It's also a pretty crisp car in terms of the creases and the bends and folds in the sheet metal. That hood crease is very distinctive and I would say sharp. So are the fender lines and how they transition from horizontal to vertical surfaces. You'll notice in this photo how that changes the reflections and the highlights, unlike, again, the Caprice that has more, I'll say, softer radii and allows the highlights to transition more smoothly. And here you can see better that pair of feature lines, the one on the top that's accentuated by the Brightwork, the one on the bottom that, again, is pretty sharp and distinctive on this car. By the way, the four-door that you see here also has fender skirts. Couldn't get fender skirts on the Caprice or the LTD. So it just adds to that frame look, as obviously it's continued on in the fender skirt. That feature line, the lower feature line, is continued in the fender skirt. And definitely casts some different shadows on the car when you see the lighting. So notice the low light underneath that Brightwork, and it runs the entire length of the car. Very flat beltline car, very inset glass. The glass is far inboard from the outer edge of the doors, kind of similar to that Continental roofline on the 61 Continental. And don't think that that's not coincidental, because Elwood Engel was now the chief designer over at Chrysler Corporation, and he was an individual who was instrumental in the design of that 61 Continental. So the Plymouth has a little bit of that Continental, even though the Continental obviously was a Ford product, not a Chrysler product. Now, unfortunately, there aren't many great photos of the Plymouth VIP in high resolution available online. The cars are so rare today, so we'll just have to make do with this one. And I think this is probably the most handsome view of the VIP. I love the roof line that Chrysler had on these two doors. And you notice the C-pillars touch down way inboard from the quarter panel edge, just like the glass planes are shoved inboard. So it just helps accentuate the width of the body. Out back, you have an interesting rear end that I hesitate to say it has a similar theme to the Flairbird, the 64, 65 Thunderbird. The Flairbird would continue into 66, but the tail lamps would become more wall-to-wall in 1966. So similar to the 64, 65 Thunderbird. And you even have a similarity in terms of the deck lid formation with that divot in the middle of it, similar to what the Thunderbird had. So again, Elwood Engel, maybe he was stealing some Ford design elements here, given that's where he came from. The one thing that just doesn't really sit well from my end in looking at this vantage point is the bumper. It just looks like it's not something that was well-shaped to the car and probably was cheap. And that's why Plymouth did it. And I think they thought that they could get away with it. But the rest of the sheet metal on the VIP is pretty exquisitely styled, I think. And as we transition to the interior, just like the LTD and the Caprice, Plymouth put a lot into the VIP. Notice the very, let's say, costly and extensive pleating on the seats. Each of those stitches certainly is something that would cost money and not what you would normally find in a lower-end car. But it looks great, as does the faux wood grain on the door panels and the Brightwork on the instrument panel. I think it's a very handsome theme with that big boxy speedometer, the gauges off to the left. Plymouth actually gave you some gauges as standard equipment, and the LTD is an example. You really didn't get similar amounts of gauges as what Plymouth provided for you here. But just a nice, comfortable place to be. Beautiful, beautiful trim. The door panels are a little bit pedestrian, but still, I think, upscale in how they look, but overall a great package. Now, in the underhood department, it's really hard to say who had top dibs. And over at Chevrolet, you got a standard 283 cubic inch two-barrel V8. There were optional 327 cubic inch V8s, 396, a 396 cubic inch V8, and then a pair of 427s. The top rated one, as you see here, was 425 gross horsepower. So you really could get a screamer of a Caprice with a big block Chevrolet if you wanted, or you could just get the standard 283, which pushed the car around just fine, all of which were excellent engines. Over at the Ford side of the house, you had a similar bevy of engine options. You got the standard 289 cubic inch Ford small block. One up from that was a 352 cubic inch V8. Then there were a few 390 cubic inch V8s available in regular and premium fuel. Then there was this 428 cubic inch V8 that made 345 horsepower. And then there were a pair of Cobra 427 cubic inch V8s, one which made 410 gross horsepower, topped by a 4-barrel carburetor, and then one that made 425 horsepower, topped by two 4-barrel carburetors. So you certainly got the most carburation when you got a Ford of the era, the LTD, because the Chevrolet just used one 4-barrel carburetor to make that 425 horsepower. Here you had dual 4 barrels. Now, over at Plymouth, you were left out a little bit from the horsepower wars because you didn't get a standard 318 cubic inch V8 that was a bit larger than what Ford and Chevrolet offered as standard. Then there was a pair of 383 cubic inch V8s, and the top engine was a 365 horsepower 440 V8. But that was it. You really could not get anything beyond that in your VIP. No Hemi here, although that would have been pretty sweet. So you were left to do with the 440. In general, though, all the Chrysler engines were robust, as well as the torque flight transmissions, and you didn't really have to be in the penalty box if you got your Plymouth VIP. They were good cars, too. So which one would I pick? Well, I have to say I would pick the Caprice. I think it was the best styled of all of them. It had very smooth 427 cubic inch V8s if you wanted to get big block power. Had a great interior, great ride, relatively good handling. The LTD had a lot of things going for it, but the handling on the LTD was just atrocious, and the steering gear is way too slow for my liking. I think GM had really good steering gears compared to Ford during this era. And the VIP with its torsion bar, front suspension, leaf spring rear is a little bit too stiff for my taste, as is the styling. A little bit upright and stiff, kind of like the LTD. The Caprice would have been the car that I bought for 1966, but what would you have procured? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.